Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere so cold that your eyelashes freeze into tiny icicles within seconds, where the air itself seems to crack and splinter around you, and where people casually carry fish that have turned into solid wooden planks under their arms like they're hauling 2x4s from a hardware store. We're talking about Siberia, specifically the parts of Siberia where winter doesn't just visit, it moves in, unpacks its bags, and stays for 8 months straight with temperatures that regularly dip to minus 50 degrees Celsius. You're probably thinking your last winter was rough because you had to scrape ice off your windshield a few times, but let me tell you, you wouldn't survive 10 minutes in the places we're exploring tonight without serious gear and a healthy respect for what cold can actually do to the human body. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you in California winding down after sunset? Maybe you're in London with rain tapping at your window? Or perhaps you're actually in Russia somewhere, nodding along because you've seen frozen fish carried exactly this way? I love hearing from you all. It makes this little corner of the internet feel less like shouting into the void and more like we're all sitting around sharing stories before bed. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in Yakutsk, the coldest major city on Earth, sometime in late January. The thermometer outside reads minus 47 degrees Celsius. That's minus 52 Fahrenheit for my American friends, and this is considered a relatively mild day. The locals aren't even wearing their heaviest coats yet. You watch as a woman in her 60s trudges past you on the icy sidewalk, and under her right arm, held horizontally like a baseball bat, is what appears to be a thick plank of wood. Except it's not wood at all. It's a fish. A frozen fish so solid you could probably use it to hammer nails, and she's carrying it home from the market as casually as you might carry a baguette in Paris. This isn't some quirky one-off thing you've stumbled upon. All around you, people are transporting fish in the same manner. A man stacks 3 frozen salmon into a wheeled cart, arranging them in a crisscross pattern like firewood. A teenager walks by with a massive frozen pike balanced on his shoulder. Nobody finds this strange. This is just Tuesday in Siberia, where the extreme cold has shaped not just survival strategies but entire cultural practices around food, and particularly around fish, the protein that has sustained human life in these impossible conditions for thousands of years. Siberia is massive, covering roughly 13.1 million square kilometers, which makes it larger than Canada and almost as big as the entire continent of Antarctica. It stretches from the Ural Mountains in the west all the way to the Pacific Ocean in the east, and from the Arctic Ocean down to the borders of Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and China. Most of it sits atop permafrost, ground that remains frozen year-round, sometimes to depths of 1,500 meters. The winters here aren't just cold. They're existentially cold, the kind of cold that makes you question whether humans were ever meant to inhabit such places. And yet, inhabit them we have. Indigenous peoples like the Yakuts, Evenks, and Chukchi have called Siberia home for millennia, developing ingenious ways to not just survive but thrive in conditions that would send most modern city dwellers running for the nearest tropical beach. When the Russians began expanding eastward in the 16th and 17th centuries, they encountered these communities who had already figured out what every newcomer to Siberia eventually learns. In a place this cold, nature does half your work for you, but only if you learn to work with it rather than against it. Let's talk about what cold actually means in Siberia. In Oymyakon, a rural locality in the Sakha Republic, the temperature hit minus 67.7 degrees Celsius in 1933. That's the lowest temperature ever recorded in an inhabited place. At those temperatures, the physical world behaves in ways that seem almost supernatural if you're not prepared for them. Exposed skin freezes in under a minute. If you're foolish enough to go outside without proper face covering, your breath crystallizes instantly, creating what locals call the whisper of the stars, a soft, tinkling sound as the moisture from your breath turns to ice crystals and falls to the ground. Metal becomes dangerously brittle. Steel can shatter like glass. Car tires can crack and split. Even the ground beneath your feet sounds different, harder, more resonant, as if you're walking on a giant drum made of frozen earth. This extreme environment creates a natural deep freeze that's more powerful and reliable than any human-made refrigeration system. And for thousands of years, the people of Siberia have understood this and exploited it brilliantly. When you catch a fish in these conditions, it doesn't spoil, it can't. Within minutes of being pulled from the water, the fish begins to freeze solid. Within an hour, depending on the ambient temperature and the size of the fish, it's as hard as a plank of oak. This instantaneous preservation is what made fish the cornerstone of Siberian survival. You're walking through the market now, careful with each step because the ice beneath your boots is slick and unforgiving. Your guide, let's call him Mikhail, is a 72-year-old Yakut man whose family has lived in this region for more generations than anyone bothers counting. He's showing you the fish section of the market, which looks less like a seafood counter and more like a lumber yard. Rows upon rows of frozen fish stand upright in wooden crates, lean against walls, and lie stacked in pyramids. There are omul from Lake Baikal, their silvery scales frosted with ice. There are massive sturgeon, some as tall as you are, standing vertically like sentinels. Salmon, pike, whitefish, and dozens of species you don't even recognize. All frozen solid, all waiting to be purchased and carried home like construction materials. Mikhail picks up a mid-sized salmon, hefting it in one hand to show you. "Good fish," he says in accented but clear English. "Caught yesterday morning, frozen on the ice before noon. Will stay good until March, April, maybe longer." He taps it against a wooden post, and it makes a solid thunk. "See? Like wood. Very good." Ash. He's not being metaphorical. The fish has literally become as rigid and dense as wood, its moisture content transformed into ice crystals that permeate every cell. This isn't some modern innovation born of convenience. Historians trace the practice of freeze-drying and transporting frozen fish in Siberia back at least to the 13th century, when the Mongol Empire's expansion brought new administrative attention to the region. But the indigenous peoples were doing it long before that. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities along Siberia's great rivers were freezing fish for storage and transport as far back as the Neolithic period. They understood intuitively what scientists would later confirm: that rapid freezing at extreme temperatures preserves not just the safety of the meat, but much of its nutritional value and texture as well. The rivers of Siberia, the Lena, the Yenisei, the Ob, the Amur, are some of the longest and most powerful waterways on the planet, and they teem with fish. In summer, these rivers are highways of life, their waters rich with salmon making their spawning runs, with sturgeon that can live for a century, with countless smaller species that form the base of a complex ecosystem. But summer in Siberia is brief, sometimes as short as 6 weeks in the far north. The rest of the year, these rivers are frozen solid, with ice thick enough to support loaded trucks driving across them. For the people who live along these rivers, the autumn fishing season is critical. This is when communities come together to catch as much fish as possible before the ice becomes too thick and before the worst of the winter sets in. Nets are deployed, traps are set, and in some traditional communities, methods that have barely changed in centuries are still employed. The fish that are caught in October and November are immediately exposed to the freezing air. No processing required, no salt, no smoking, no drying in the sun. Just the ambient temperature doing its work. Within hours, you have fish that will remain preserved for months without any additional intervention. You watch as a younger man, maybe in his 30s, approaches a stack of frozen pike. He's selecting fish the way you might select lumber at a home improvement store, checking each one for size and condition, looking for straight specimens without too much damage. He settles on for large pike, tucks 2 under each arm, and walks away. It looks absurd if you're not from here, but it makes perfect sense when you think about it. The fish are solid, stackable, and easy to transport. They won't leak, they won't smell, they won't spoil. They're stable, durable packages of protein that can be stored almost anywhere it's cold, which in Siberia means almost anywhere, period. Mikhail explains that his grandmother used to keep frozen fish in a special shed behind their house, stacked neatly like cordwood. No electricity, he says with a small smile. No refrigerator, just the shed and winter. Fish stayed good all season. Sometimes we would eat fish from October catch in March, April. Always fresh tasting when you cook it right. He pauses, watching the market activity around you. Americans have big freezers in their homes, yes? Use electricity to keep food cold? Here, we just use Siberia. It's a funny line, and he's clearly said it before to foreign visitors, but it's also profoundly true. The environment itself is the infrastructure. The cold that makes life difficult in so many ways also makes certain kinds of life possible. Without the ability to freeze and store fish, the long Siberian winter would be far more precarious for human communities. Historians still argue whether Siberia could have supported its current population levels without this natural refrigeration system, or whether settlements would have remained far smaller and more scattered without the ability to preserve large quantities of protein. You're starting to feel the cold now, even through your layers of clothing. Your fingers are getting numb, and you can feel the moisture in your nostrils freezing slightly with each breath. Mikhail notices and chuckles. You want to go inside soon, yes? Have tea. You nod gratefully, but before you leave the market, he wants to show you one more thing. He leads you to a woman selling what he calls stroganina, a traditional Yakut dish that's about as Siberian as food gets. She's using a knife to shave thin, translucent slices from a frozen fish, creating delicate ribbons of raw fish that curl as they're cut. These are served immediately, still frozen, often with just salt and pepper. You eat it frozen, Mikhail explains. It melts on your tongue. Very traditional. Very cold. You try a piece, and it's bizarre. The fish is so cold it almost burns. And then as it thaws in your mouth, the flavor blooms, clean and fresh and surprisingly delicate. It's sushi's extreme northern cousin, a dish that could only exist in a place where fish freeze solid before they have time to develop any off flavors. As you warm your hands around a cup of sweet black tea in a nearby cafe, you're beginning to understand that carrying frozen fish like wood isn't just a practical adaptation to extreme cold. It's a window into an entire way of life that's been shaped by one of the harshest environments on Earth. These frozen fish represent thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, of trial and error, of humans figuring out how to not just survive but create rich, complex cultures in conditions that seem designed to exclude us. The woman at the next table over has her shopping bag on the seat beside her, and you can see the tail of a frozen fish sticking out of it. She's sipping her tea, scrolling on her phone, completely unfazed by the fact that she's just purchased what is essentially a fish-shaped ice brick. This is normal. This is daily life. And tonight, as we settle into this story, we're going to explore how this strange practice came to be, how it works, and what it tells us about human adaptability and the cultures that have flourished in Earth's frozen extremes. Outside, the temperature is dropping as evening approaches. In a few hours, it will hit -50, and the city will grow quieter as people retreat indoors. But the frozen fish will remain, stacked in sheds and stored on balconies, waiting to be carried home, cooked and consumed, as they have been for countless generations before, and likely for countless generations to come. You're in a small research station now, about 30 kilometers outside Yakutsk, where a team of scientists studies everything from permafrost dynamics to the behavior of materials at extreme temperatures. Dr. Elena Sokolova, a physicist specializing in cryogenics, has agreed to walk you through exactly what happens to a fish when it's exposed to Siberian winter temperatures. She's standing beside a clear plexiglass chamber that can be cooled to -70 degrees Celsius, and beside it, on a metal table, lies a fresh fish, a whitefish pulled from the river just 2 hours ago, still supple and slightly damp. People think freezing is simple, Elena says, adjusting her glasses. You put something in the cold, it gets hard, done. But the physics of what happens inside a fish or any organic tissue during extreme rapid freezing is actually quite complex and fascinating. She picks up the fish with gloved hands and holds it up for you to see. This fish is about 70% water by mass. When we put it outside right now at -45 degrees, that water is going to undergo a phase transition. But how it freezes matters enormously for the quality of the preserved meat. She places the fish inside the chamber and closes the door. Through the plexiglass, you watch as she activates the cooling system. A digital thermometer on the wall begins dropping. -10, -15, -20. In a standard home freezer, Elena continues, which operates around -18 Celsius, fish freezes relatively slowly over the course of several hours. This slow freezing allows large ice crystals to form within the cells. Those crystals have sharp edges. They puncture cell membranes, they damage tissue structure. When you thaw that fish later, all the cellular fluid that was displaced by ice crystal formation leaks out. The fish becomes mushy, loses flavor, loses nutritional value. The thermometer in the chamber hits -30, -35. You can see frost beginning to form on the fish's surface. But out here, Elena says, gesturing toward the window where the Siberian twilight is deepening, the fish freezes in minutes, not hours. The temperature differential is so extreme that ice crystals don't have time to grow large. Instead, you get what we call microcrystalline structure, millions of tiny ice crystals that form almost simultaneously throughout the tissue. These microcrystals do far less damage to cell walls and membranes. The chamber's thermometer stabilizes at -50. Elena waits another 5 minutes, then opens the door and removes the fish. It's completely rigid now, covered in a thin layer of frost. She taps it against the metal table. Thunk, thunk, the same sound you heard Mikhail make with the salmon at the market. In 15 minutes, she says, we've achieved what would take hours in a commercial blast freezer. This fish, if kept at these temperatures, will remain in near-perfect condition for 6 months or more. The Japanese pay premium prices for fish frozen this way. They understand that the quality of the freeze determines the quality of the final product. It's not just about preservation, though. Elena explains that the rapid freeze effectively suspends biological processes mid-action. Enzymes that would normally begin breaking down tissue after death don't have time to do much work before they're locked in place by the cold. Bacteria that might cause spoilage are still present, but they become completely inactive, not dead, just in a state of suspended animation that lasts as long as the fish remains frozen. It's like pressing pause on decomposition, Elena says. Not stop, just pause. When you thaw the fish, those processes can resume, which is why proper thawing technique matters too. But while frozen, time essentially stands still for this fish at the cellular level. You're watching Elena demonstrate something else now. She's taken 2 identical whitefish, one frozen slowly in a standard freezer, one frozen rapidly in Siberian conditions, and she's thawing them both under controlled conditions. The slowly frozen fish, as it thaws, begins to release significant amounts of liquid. A pinkish fluid pools around it on the tray. The meat looks somewhat gray and limp. The rapidly frozen fish, by contrast, releases much less liquid. When Elena cuts into both with a knife, the difference is obvious. The slowly frozen fish has a soft, somewhat spongy texture, while the rapidly frozen specimen is firm and clean-looking. This is why Siberians have always preferred their natural freeze method, Elena explains. They didn't understand the physics, they didn't need to. They just knew from centuries of experience that fish frozen quickly in winter cold tasted better, had better texture, stayed good longer. Science has caught up and can now explain why their traditional methods work so well, but they've been getting superior results for hundreds of years without knowing about ice crystal morphology or cellular membrane dynamics. Historians still argue whether the quality difference was actually noticed by ancient peoples or whether it's a modern appreciation, but Elena is convinced that early Siberians absolutely understood they were working with superior freezing conditions. You don't continue a practice for 1,000 years if it's not giving you good results, she points out. These people were intimately connected to their food sources. They would have noticed if winter-caught fish tasted better than fish preserved other ways. That knowledge would have been passed down, even if the why wasn't understood. There's another physical property of frozen fish that makes them particularly suitable for being carried like lumber. They become remarkably strong. Elena shows you a stress test setup where she's placed a frozen salmon horizontally across 2 supports, like a bridge. She begins adding weights to the center of the fish. 5 kilograms, 10, 15, 20. The frozen salmon doesn't bend. At 25 kilograms, you can see the slightest bow developing, but it's still holding. Frozen tissue is incredibly rigid, Elena says. The ice crystals create an internal matrix that's almost like rebar in concrete. You could genuinely use this fish as a structural element if you needed to. People joke about using frozen fish as hammers or clubs, but it's not really a joke, you absolutely could. She's done experiments measuring the hardness of frozen fish using the same scales used for wood. A well-frozen salmon at -40 comes in at around 3,500 on the Janka hardness scale. That's harder than eastern white pine, about the same as hemlock. So when people compare frozen fish to wood, Elena says with a slight smile, they're being more accurate than they realize. From a material science perspective, a frozen fish really does behave like a piece of wood. The Russians weren't the first to notice this, of course. Indigenous communities throughout the Arctic and subarctic developed similar practices wherever conditions allowed. The Inuit of northern Canada and Alaska, the Sami of northern Scandinavia, the Aleut of the Aleutian Islands. All of these cultures developed ways to freeze and store fish for winter consumption. But Siberia's particular combination of massive rivers, abundant fish populations, and extreme, stable cold created conditions where the practice could scale up beyond just family or village level. You're looking at photographs Elena has collected from historical archives. One image from the 1890s shows a Russian trading post on the Lena River, and in the foreground are enormous stacks of frozen fish, arranged in neat rows like a lumberyard. The caption indicates that these fish would be loaded onto sleds and transported hundreds of kilometers to mining settlements in the interior. Another photograph from the 1930s shows workers in Vladivostok unloading frozen fish from a train car, tossing them like logs onto waiting carts. The Trans-Siberian Railway changed everything, Elena mentions, noticing which photograph you're studying. Suddenly you could move frozen fish thousands of kilometers. As long as they stayed frozen during transport, and in Siberian winter that's not hard, you could ship fish caught in the Arctic to markets in Moscow. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That's more about economics and infrastructure. The physics is what makes it all possible. She wants to show you one more thing before you leave. She takes you to a storage facility behind the research station where they keep samples at various temperatures. She opens a door marked -60, and you're hit with air so cold it feels like a physical force pushing against your face. Inside are rows of shelves containing fish specimens, each carefully labeled with the date it was frozen and various data points. Some of these fish have been frozen for over a decade. These are part of a long-term study on preservation quality. Elena explains, her breath creating clouds of vapor that freeze into tiny ice particles almost instantly. She pulls out a fish labeled Omel, frozen November 2014, Lake Baikal. That's over 11 years ago. We periodically thaw and test these samples. So far, we've found that fish frozen at -60 and kept at that temperature show virtually no degradation even after 15 years. The limiting factor isn't the cold. It's freezer burn from sublimation if they're not properly sealed. But in Siberia, where relative humidity is low and temperatures are stable, fish wrapped in simple cloth and kept in unheated sheds can last multiple seasons without any significant quality loss. You're thinking about the practicality of this as you step back outside, your face stinging from the cold. In a world before electricity, before gas-powered refrigeration, before any of the modern preservation techniques we take for granted, the people of Siberia had access to what amounts to a perfect natural freezer that operated reliably for 8 months of the year. They didn't need to salt their fish, which requires access to salt, a commodity that had to be traded for or traveled great distances to obtain. They didn't need to smoke their fish, which requires wood and time and careful attention. They didn't need to dry their fish, which works well in some climates but is less effective in humid conditions. They just needed to catch the fish and leave it outside. But there's a catch, and Elena is careful to point it out. This only works because of how cold it gets here, she emphasizes. That rarity is part of what makes the Siberian frozen fish tradition so distinctive. You need just the right combination of climate, fish abundance, and cultural development to create a situation where carrying fish like lumber becomes not just possible but optimal. There are only a handful of places on Earth where these conditions align, and even among those places, Siberia stands out for the sheer scale of the practice. As you drive back toward Yakutsk, the darkness now complete, you notice lights from scattered houses across the landscape. You know that behind many of those houses, in sheds and on covered porches and sometimes just stacked against the outside wall, there are frozen fish waiting to be eaten. Some of them might have been caught just days ago. Others might have been frozen since October or November and will last until spring. They're all as hard as wood, all perfectly preserved, all testament to the remarkable physics of extreme cold and the human ingenuity that learned to harness it. The temperature outside is -48 now. Through the car window, you can see the vapor from the vehicle's exhaust crystallizing and falling to the ground like snow. Everything here, the air, the ground, the very atmosphere, is in a state that seems hostile to life. And yet, life persists, thrives even. And those frozen fish, solid as planks, are part of how that miracle happens every winter, year after year, generation after generation. You're sitting in a yurt now, warmed by a central stove that glows with burning wood, and across from you is an elderly Evenki woman named Katerina. She's 93 years old, and her face carries the kind of deep lines that come from decades of squinting against snow glare and wind. Her hands, gnarled and strong, are working on a piece of embroidery while she talks, and occasionally she pauses to sip tea from a ceramic cup. She's agreed to tell you about how her grandmother's grandmother, going back 7 generations, preserved fish in the old way before there were markets, before there were Russian settlements, when the Evenki people moved with the seasons and lived entirely from what the land and rivers provided. My grandmother told me stories, Katerina begins, her Russian accented with the cadence of her native Evenki language, that in the very old days before the Russians came, our people would gather at the rivers in the autumn. Whole families, whole clans. The fish would be running, so many fish you could almost walk across the river on their backs. This was our harvest, like farmers harvesting grain, except our fields were the rivers and our crops swam upstream to meet us. The Evenki, along with other indigenous Siberian peoples, developed sophisticated techniques for processing and preserving fish long before they had any contact with agricultural societies or their preservation technologies. These weren't primitive people making do with limited options. They were specialists who had refined their methods over thousands of years of continuous habitation in one of Earth's most demanding environments. Katerina explains that her ancestors recognized different types of cold and how each affected fish preservation. There is the first cold in September, early October, she says, setting down her embroidery to gesture with both hands. This cold comes and goes, not stable. Fish frozen in first cold might thaw, might freeze again. Not good. We would eat those fish quickly or smoke them. Then comes the second cold, usually late October, early November. This cold arrives and stays. The river begins to freeze from the edges. The ground becomes hard. This is when we catch the most fish, because this is the cold that preserves perfectly. Her description aligns remarkably well with what modern science understands about freeze preservation. That second cold, she describes, corresponds to the point where ambient temperatures drop below -25 or -30 and remain stable. Her ancestors didn't have thermometers, but they didn't need them. They could read the signs in the environment, in the behavior of animals, in the texture of the air itself. The technique, as Katerina describes it, was elegantly simple. Fish would be caught using nets or, in shallower waters, basket traps that had been used for generations. The fish would be killed quickly, a sharp blow to the head, and then gutted immediately. You must remove the insides while the fish is still warm, Katerina emphasizes. If you wait, if the insides freeze with the fish, the meat takes on bitter taste. Bad flavor. My grandmother was very strict about this. No matter how cold, no matter how tired, you clean the fish immediately. Once gutted, the fish would be laid out on the ice or snow in rows, spaced apart so air could circulate. Within an hour, sometimes less, they would be frozen solid. But here's where the traditional knowledge gets particularly interesting. The Evenki would sometimes cover the fish with snow for the first part of the freezing process. Katerina explains that the snow acted as insulation, causing the fish to freeze slightly more slowly than if left completely exposed. This made the meat more tender when you cook it later, she says. Fish frozen too fast, too hard, can be tough. A little snow, just enough to slow the freeze by small amount, made better eating. Historians still argue whether this snow-covering technique was actually about controlling the freezing rate or simply about protecting the fish from scavenging birds and foxes. But Katerina insists her grandmother was explicit about the textural benefits. Either way, it demonstrates a level of sophistication in understanding preservation that goes beyond simply put fish in cold, fish stays good. Once frozen, the fish would be stored. Different communities had different methods, but Katerina's ancestors built special platforms. raised structures made from larch wood that kept the fish off the ground and away from most scavengers. The platform must be high enough that wolves cannot reach, she explains, but not so high that you need a ladder every time you want to fish for dinner. About this tall. She holds her hand at roughly chest height. These platforms, called labaz in Russian, were essentially outdoor freezers, but they served another purpose too. They marked territory and stored wealth. A family with a well-stocked labaz was a family that had fished successfully and would eat well through the winter. The fish on these platforms were often arranged vertically, leaning against each other in a pattern that maximized space and allowed air circulation. Sound familiar? It's the same basic principle you saw in the modern Yakutsk market. Frozen fish standing upright or stacked efficiently. The practice is ancient, and it persists because it works. When something is frozen solid, you can treat it architecturally, stacking and arranging it in ways that would be impossible with fresh fish. Katerina gets up, moving more spryly than you'd expect for someone in her 90s, and retrieves something from a wooden chest in the corner of the yurt. It's a knife, or rather, a specialized cutting tool with a curved blade. "This is for frozen fish," she says, running her thumb carefully along the blade's edge. "You cannot cut frozen fish with a regular knife. Too hard. You need a blade like this, and you need to know the technique. My grandmother could shave a frozen fish into pieces so thin you could see light through them. That's stroganina, the dish you tried at the market. Very traditional. Very old. The preparation of stroganina is itself an art form that could only have developed in a culture that routinely worked with frozen fish. The name comes from the Russian verb strogat, meaning to plane or shave, like shaving wood. The fish must be frozen absolutely solid. If it's even slightly thawed, the technique doesn't work. The person doing the cutting holds the fish vertically, usually anchored somehow, and uses a sharp blade to shave off thin ribbons of frozen flesh. These ribbons curl naturally as they're cut, creating delicate spirals of frozen fish that are served immediately. In the very old days, Katerina says, settling back into her seat, this was celebration food. When hunters came back successful, when families gathered, when we had ceremonies, we would prepare stroganina. Everyone would sit in a circle and the fish would be passed around, and people would eat these frozen pieces with just a little salt. It was special. Now you can buy it at any market, but in those days it meant something. It meant the fish were good. The freeze was good. The clan was prosperous. She's describing a culture where frozen fish weren't just food. They were a form of currency, a marker of status, a gift given to strengthen alliances between families. When Russians first arrived in Siberia in the 16th century, they found indigenous peoples who had complex economies partially based on frozen fish. Communities that controlled good fishing areas could trade their preserved fish to communities that specialized in hunting or reindeer herding. The fish could be transported vast distances because, well, they were frozen solid and required no special handling beyond keeping them cold, which in Siberian winter was automatic. There's a document in the Russian State Archive Katerina mentions. She's heard about it from a historian who visited years ago, describing a tribute payment from a Yakut community to Russian colonial authorities in 1642. The payment included furs, of course, but also 200 frozen fish of good quality. Even the Russian colonizers quickly understood that frozen fish were valuable and transportable. They became part of the economic system almost immediately. But let's talk about something that often gets overlooked in discussions of traditional preservation methods: nutrition. Modern nutritional science has confirmed what traditional peoples learned through experience: that properly frozen fish retains nearly all of its nutritional value. The omega-3 fatty acids that make fish so healthy remain stable through freezing. The proteins remain intact. Vitamins like B12 and D, which are crucial for people living in environments with little sunlight and limited dietary variety, are preserved. In fact, some studies suggest that eating fish frozen and raw, as in stroganina, may actually preserve certain heat-sensitive nutrients better than cooking does. Katerina's ancestors, living through 8-month winters with no access to fresh vegetables, no grains unless they traded for them, and limited opportunities for hunting during the darkest months, relied on fish as their primary source of nutrition from November through April. The fact that their preservation method maintained the fish's nutritional profile was, quite literally, a matter of survival. Communities that preserved fish poorly, that allowed spoilage or degradation, would have suffered nutritional deficiencies. Communities that did it well, like Katerina's, thrived. My grandmother lived to 97, Katerina says with a note of pride. Her mother lived to 94. Both of them ate frozen fish almost every day of their lives for at least half the year. Stroganina, boiled fish, fish soup, fish pie. We were fish people. Still are, those of us who remember the old ways. She shows you something else, a set of photographs, some of them dating back to the early 20th century. One image shows a group of Evenki men standing beside a massive pile of frozen fish, arranged in a pyramid that comes up to their chests. They're all wearing traditional clothing, fur parkas, boots made from reindeer hide, hats with ear flaps. They look simultaneously stern and satisfied, like they've accomplished something significant. Katerina identifies one of the men as her great-grandfather. This photo was taken in 1924, she says. That pile of fish, that was our wealth for the winter. Maybe 300, 400 fish. Enough for the extended family, enough to trade, enough to feel secure. You see how they're stacked? Very carefully. Each layer going opposite direction, like building a structure. If you stack them carelessly, the pile can collapse. Fish can be damaged. But if you do it right, very stable. I helped my mother stack fish like this when I was a girl. It was satisfying work. Cold work, hard work, but satisfying. The labor involved in traditional fish preservation was substantial and communal. It wasn't something one person could do alone, at least not at the scale needed to support a family through winter. Everyone participated. Men did most of the catching and the heavy hauling. Women typically handled the gutting and initial processing. Children helped with organizing and stacking. Elders supervised and passed on knowledge. It was a seasonal rhythm that organized social life, created shared purpose, and reinforced cultural bonds. Katerina mentions something you hadn't considered: the spiritual dimension. We had ceremonies, she says quietly. Before the fishing season, we would make offerings to the river spirits, asking for abundant catch and safe conditions. After the fishing, when all the fish were caught and frozen and properly stored, we would have another ceremony, giving thanks. The fish gave their lives so we could live. This was serious, sacred even. This spiritual relationship with fish and rivers is common among indigenous peoples who depend on aquatic resources, but it takes on particular intensity in places like Siberia where the margin for error is so slim. A bad fishing season in a more temperate climate might mean going hungry. A bad fishing season in Siberia could mean death. The respect and ritual surrounding fish preservation wasn't just cultural tradition. It was an acknowledgement of how high the stakes were. As your conversation with Katerina winds down, she offers you one more piece of traditional wisdom. My grandmother used to say that the river gives us fish, the cold preserves them, and our hands make them into meals. 3 gifts working together. If any one of those gifts fails, if the fish don't run, if the cold doesn't come strong and steady, if our hands become lazy or forgetful, then we suffer. We had to be worthy of those gifts. That meant respecting the process, doing it right, teaching the next generation. The frozen fish you carry home on your shoulder, that fish represents all of this. It's not just food. It's tradition, it's survival, it's connection to the land and water and cold. When you understand that, you understand why we still do things this way, even now when we have electricity and refrigerators. It's who we are. Outside the yurt, the night is absolutely clear, and the stars are so bright and numerous they seem almost artificial. The temperature has dropped to -51. Somewhere out there, on platforms and in sheds and stacked against the walls of houses, frozen fish wait. As they've waited for thousands of years, preserved by cold, ready to sustain life through the dark months, carried like wood because that's exactly what they resemble and exactly what makes them so perfectly suited to this harsh, beautiful land. You're in Moscow now, in the depths of a climate-controlled archive that smells of old paper and preservation chemicals, flipping through documents that date back to the Stalin era. The archivist, a meticulous man named Dmitry, has pulled files for you from the State Planning Committee Gosplan, the bureaucratic machine that attempted to organize every aspect of Soviet economic life. Among the 5-year plans and production quotas and ideological declarations, you find something unexpected: detailed directives about frozen fish distribution, complete with charts showing tonnage requirements for various Siberian settlements and calculations about how many frozen fish per capita would be needed to meet nutritional standards for workers in the far north. The Soviets were obsessed with rationalization. Dmitry explains, adjusting his reading glasses. They wanted to quantify everything, systematize everything, make everything conform to scientific planning. When they looked at Siberia, they saw a region that was economically backward by their standards. Indigenous peoples doing things the old way, small-scale operations, traditional practices. But they also saw massive resource potential and, critically, strategic importance. They needed to populate Siberia, needed to extract its resources, and that meant they needed to feed the people they were sending there. The Soviet approach to Siberian fish wasn't to replace the traditional freezing methods. Those worked too well to abandon, but to industrialize and centralize them. In the 1930s and 1940s, as part of Stalin's push to develop the Soviet Far East, the government established state fishing collectives called fishing kolkhozes. These weren't small family operations. They were large-scale enterprises designed to catch fish by the ton and distribute them throughout the Soviet Union. You're looking at a document from 1936, a production report from a fishing collective on the Lena River. The numbers are staggering. 240 tons of frozen fish processed in November alone, destined for mining camps in the Kolyma region. That's roughly 240,000 kilograms. Assuming an average fish weight of 3 kilograms, that's about 80,000 individual fish frozen, stored, and transported in a single month from a single collective. The genius of the Soviet system, if you can call it that, Dmitry says, was recognizing that they didn't need to invent new preservation technology for Siberia. Nature was already providing the perfect freezer. What they needed was organization, centralized catching, standardized processing, coordinated transportation. The fish would freeze themselves. The state just had to manage the logistics. And manage they did. You're reading through a fascinating directive from 1938 that establishes quality standards for frozen fish in the Soviet system. Fish had to be frozen within 4 hours of being caught. They had to be gutted properly. They had to be stored at temperatures below -25°C. They had to be stacked in specific ways to maximize storage efficiency in railway cars and warehouses. There were even specifications for how frozen fish should be wrapped. Heavy paper treated with wax to prevent freezer burn, bound with twine in a particular pattern. What strikes you is how much of this new Soviet system was actually just codifying what indigenous peoples had already been doing for centuries. The 4-hour freezing window? Traditional fishers knew that fish needed to freeze quickly. The gutting requirements? Katerina already told you about that. The stacking patterns? You saw those in the old photographs. The Soviets didn't invent frozen fish logistics, they industrialized existing knowledge. But they did add scale. Dmitry shows you photographs from the 1940s and 1950s showing the infrastructure that was built to support the frozen fish economy. Massive wooden warehouses, unheated but insulated, where fish could be stored by the hundreds of tons. Railway sidings with special platforms for loading frozen fish directly from storage into refrigerated cars. Except the cars weren't refrigerated in the modern sense. In winter, they were just regular cars. The ambient temperature kept the fish frozen. In summer, the fish had to be transported in cars packed with ice, which was far less efficient. There's an interesting paradox here, Dmitry notes. In summer, when fish were more abundant and easier to catch, they were harder to preserve and transport. In winter, when fishing was more difficult, preservation was automatic. The Soviet planners recognized this and tried to shift as much fishing effort as possible to the late autumn freeze period. They wanted to catch and freeze as much fish as possible in October and November, then distribute those frozen stocks throughout the winter and spring. You're looking at a propaganda poster from 1952 now. It shows a heroic-looking worker holding a frozen fish aloft like a trophy, with text that translates to Siberian gold, feeding the socialist future. It's absurd and grandiose in the way Soviet propaganda often was, but it also reflects how important frozen fish had become to the economic planning of the USSR. Siberia wasn't just a frozen wasteland to the Soviets. It was a larder, a vast natural freezer that could supply protein to the entire country if properly exploited. The fish weren't just for Siberia either. Dmitry pulls out shipping manifests showing frozen fish from Siberian rivers being transported as far west as Leningrad and as far south as the Central Asian republics. The difficulty was keeping them frozen during transport, he explains. In winter, no problem, but moving frozen fish in summer, across thousands of kilometers, that required ice, insulation, speed. It was expensive and wasteful. A lot of fish spoiled. But the state considered it worth it because fish represented high-quality protein, and protein shortages were a chronic problem in the Soviet Union. There's a darker side to this story, and Dmitry doesn't shy away from it. Much of the fishing infrastructure in Siberia during the Stalin era was built using forced labor prisoners in the Gulag system. The Kolyma region, which you've already seen mentioned in these documents, was one of the deadliest parts of the Gulag. Tens of thousands of people died there, working in gold mines and fishing operations under conditions that were brutal even by Siberian standards. The fish you saw being sold in the Yakutsk market today, Dmitry says quietly, they're part of a tradition that has both indigenous roots and Soviet industrial history. Some of that history is admirable, the organization, the efficiency, the spread of food security to remote areas. Some of it is horrifying. The same fish that fed workers building new cities also fed prisoners being worked to death in labor camps. It's complicated. You're reading testimonies now, declassified documents from former Gulag prisoners. One man describes working at a fishing collective on the Indigirka River in 1948. He writes about handling frozen fish with inadequate gloves, his hands becoming so cold that the skin would crack and bleed. He describes quotas that seemed impossible. Each worker expected to process hundreds of fish per shift, in temperatures that regularly dropped below -40. He mentions that frozen fish were sometimes the only food the prisoners received. Boiled into a thin soup, barely enough calories to sustain men doing hard labor in extreme cold. These testimonies are difficult to read, but they're part of the story. The Soviet rationalization of frozen fish production wasn't a neutral technical achievement. It was entangled with political repression, forced labor, and the brutality of Stalinist economic policy. The same natural phenomenon that had sustained indigenous communities for millennia was weaponized by the state as part of its broader system of exploitation and control. But the system also had unintended effects. As Dmitry points out, the Soviet emphasis on fish as a protein source meant that even remote Siberian villages received attention and resources that they might not have otherwise. Infrastructure was built, roads, railways, communication lines to support fish distribution. Medical facilities were established to serve workers in the fishing collectives. Schools were opened. The motivations weren't altruistic, Dmitry says, but the effects were sometimes beneficial. Many of the communities that exist in Siberia today were established or expanded during the Soviet period specifically to support fish harvesting and processing. You're looking at a map from 1955 that shows the fish transportation network of the Soviet Far East. It's a complex web of railway lines, river routes, and roads, all color-coded by season and capacity. At key nodes are facilities marked as fish storage and processing centers. The map looks like a circulatory system, with the rivers of Siberia as arteries and frozen fish as the blood flowing through them. Dmitry mentions something interesting, the role of war. During World War II, when the Soviet Union was desperate for food to feed both its military and its civilian population, Siberian frozen fish became strategically critical. There's a classified report from 1943, he says, pulling yet another file, estimating that frozen fish from Siberia provided approximately 8% of the total protein consumed by Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. That's millions of meals. That's hundreds of thousands of soldiers sustained, in part, by fish that were caught in Arctic rivers, frozen in Siberian winters, and transported thousands of kilometers to the front lines. The logistics of this were mind-boggling. Fish frozen in October 1942 might reach soldiers in Stalingrad by January 1943, still perfectly preserved, still nutritious. The same natural freezing process that indigenous families had used to feed themselves through one winter was now feeding an entire military campaign. Historians still argue whether the Soviet Union could have sustained its war effort without access to Siberian resources, including frozen fish, but there's no question that they played a significant role. After the war, the Soviet fish system continued to expand. The 1950s and 1960s saw the construction of larger, more modern processing facilities. Mechanization increased, machines for gutting fish, conveyor systems for sorting and organizing them, even early attempts at automated packing systems. But the fundamental preservation method remained the same. Catch the fish, expose it to extreme cold, let it freeze solid. Technology changed the scale and efficiency, but couldn't improve on the basic physics of rapid freezing in Siberian temperatures. You're looking at photographs from the 1970s now, showing a state-of-the-art fishing facility in Yakutsk. It's a sprawling complex of buildings and equipment, with railway sidings and truck loading bays and vast storage areas. But inside those storage areas, the fish are still just stacked on shelves, frozen solid, organized like lumber in a warehouse. For all the Soviet emphasis on modernization and scientific progress, they hadn't found a better way to store frozen fish than the method indigenous peoples had used for centuries. Keep them cold, keep them organized, stack them efficiently. Dmitry closes the last file and leans back in his chair. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, he says, and much of the system collapsed with it. Many of the state fishing collectives dissolved. The elaborate distribution networks fell apart. There were years in the 1990s when fishing in Siberia returned to something more like the traditional model: smaller operations, local distribution, family-based rather than state-organized. But the infrastructure was still there, and gradually new systems emerged. Not Soviet, but not entirely different either. The fish still freeze in the same rivers. The cold still works the same way. The methods persist because they're fundamentally sound. As you leave the archive, stepping out into Moscow's relatively mild winter, only -12 today, practically tropical compared to Siberia, you're struck by the layers of history embedded in those frozen fish you saw at the Yakutsk market. Indigenous knowledge, Russian colonial expansion, Soviet industrialization, Gulag labor, military logistics, post-Soviet restructuring, all of it visible if you know where to look, in the simple act of carrying a frozen fish home under your arm like a piece of wood. The fish themselves don't care about politics or history. They freeze according to physical laws that predate human civilization and will continue long after our economic systems have transformed beyond recognition. But the human relationship with those frozen fish, that's all history, all culture, all the complicated ways we adapt to our environment while simultaneously trying to bend it to our will. The Soviets tried to master Siberia through central planning and industrial scale. They succeeded partially, but only by working with the fundamental reality that indigenous peoples had already understood. In Siberia, the cold is your ally if you're smart enough to work with it rather than against it. You're bouncing along in a Soviet-era truck now, its suspension creaking and groaning with every rut in the ice road. Your driver, Alexei, is a man in his 50s who runs a small fish transportation business, hauling frozen fish from remote fishing communities to larger towns where they can be sold. The truck's heater is fighting a losing battle against the -43-degree air that seeps through every gap in the door seals. And you can see your breath crystallizing into frost on the inside of the windshield. In the back of the truck, stacked like cordwood and secured with ropes, are approximately 2 tons of frozen fish, mostly whitefish and pike, with a few massive sturgeon that Alexei managed to acquire from a fisherman who'd had an exceptional day. This road doesn't exist in summer, Alexei shouts over the engine noise, gesturing out the window at the landscape. What we're driving on right now. In July, this is swamp. Soft ground, water, moss impossible to cross. But in winter, everything freezes solid. The ground becomes like concrete. The rivers become highways. We can go places in winter that are completely inaccessible the rest of the year. This is one of the most important facts about Siberian fish transportation that often gets overlooked. The same extreme cold that preserves the fish also creates the infrastructure needed to move them. The winter roads of Siberia, called zimniki, are temporary routes that exist only when the ground is frozen hard enough to support vehicle weight. They're not paved, not maintained in any conventional sense. They're simply paths across the landscape that become viable when winter arrives. Alexei has been driving these routes for 23 years. He knows every section of the road, every dangerous spot where the ice might be thinner, every place where snowdrifts tend to accumulate. You have to understand the ice, he explains. River ice is different from lake ice. Lake ice is usually safer, it freezes more evenly. River ice has currents underneath, so some spots are thicker than others. You need to know where to cross, and you need to watch for warning signs. If you see water on top of the ice, that's bad. Means the ice is flexing, might crack. If you see other vehicles stopped, you stop too and find out why. The roads he travels connect small fishing villages to regional hubs, and from there, other drivers take the fish to larger cities. It's a network that functions like a spider web, with routes branching and intersecting, all of it dependent on cold weather maintaining the integrity of the ice roads. In a typical winter, this network operates from late November through early April, about 4.5 months. That's the window when fish can be moved efficiently across Siberia's vast distances. You're watching the landscape roll by, endless expanses of snow-covered taiga, frozen rivers cutting through the forest like white ribbons, occasional glimpses of wooden buildings in the distance. Every few hours, you pass another vehicle, usually another truck, sometimes a passenger car, occasionally a tracked vehicle designed specifically for Arctic conditions. Alexei waves at every driver you pass. Small community, he says. Everyone who drives Zimniki knows everyone else. We help each other. If someone breaks down out here, you don't just drive past. You stop, you help. That's the rule. The fish in the back of the truck require almost no special handling. They're already frozen solid, and the ambient temperature keeps them that way. Alexei doesn't have a refrigerated truck. He doesn't need one. The cargo area is just a standard enclosed box, unheated, which in current temperatures means it's naturally maintained at around -40. Better than any freezer, Alexei says with a grin, and no electricity bill. But transporting frozen fish isn't without its challenges. The roads, though solid enough to drive on, are rough. Alexei has to drive carefully to avoid jarring the cargo too much. Frozen fish are hard, yes, but they can still break, he explains. Hit a big bump at speed, and fish can crack, especially the bigger ones. Broken fish are worth less at market. People want whole fish, easier to store, easier to portion, looks better. So I drive smooth, steady. Take my time. You're stopped now at what Alexei calls a warming station, a small wooden building beside the road where drivers can rest, drink hot tea, and check road conditions. Inside, 3 other drivers are gathered around a wood stove, warming their hands and sharing information. One man reports that the crossing at kilometer 47 is getting risky. The ice is making noise, and there's some surface water. Better to take the alternate route, adds another 20 kilometers but safer. Everyone nods, makes mental notes. This is how the Zimniki system works: informal knowledge sharing, collective vigilance, mutual support. One of the drivers asks Alexei about his cargo, and there's a brief discussion about fish prices in Yakutsk. Pike are fetching good money this year, apparently. The sturgeon are always valuable, but they're getting harder to find. Overfishing is becoming a concern, even in Siberia's vast river systems. Whitefish are steady, reliable, the bread and butter of the frozen fish trade. Everyone has opinions about which species are best to transport, which buyers pay fairly, which routes are most efficient. You notice that when they talk about the fish, they use measurements that sound like they're discussing lumber. I've got 15 cubic meters of mixed pike and whitefish, or looking for buyers for 8 cubic meters of premium omel. The fish have become, in the logistics of transportation, essentially volumetric commodities that happen to be edible. This isn't disrespectful, it's practical. When you're moving tons of frozen fish across hundreds of kilometers, you need to think in terms of space and weight and efficiency. Back on the road, Alexei tells you about the evolution of fish transportation in his lifetime. When I was young, in the 1980s, my uncle did this work with a horse-drawn sled. Slower, but also simpler. Horses know how to handle ice better than any driver. They won't go where it's unsafe. But you can only move so much with horses. Maybe half a ton, and it takes 3 times as long. When trucks became more available in the 1990s, everything changed. You could move more fish, faster, reach more markets. The roads themselves have improved somewhat over the years, though they're still rudimentary by any standard definition. Heavy vehicles compact the snow and ice, creating smoother surfaces. Some routes now have basic markers, wooden posts, or reflective strips to help drivers navigate during snowstorms or in darkness. Organizations like the Regional Transportation Authority occasionally grade the worst sections, pushing aside excess snow or filling in dangerous spots. But fundamentally, these are still just frozen paths across wilderness, existing only at winter's sufferance. Historians still argue whether the Zimniki system enabled the growth of Siberian communities, or whether the community's survival created the Zimniki system. It's a chicken and egg question with no clear answer. What's certain is that the two are deeply interconnected. Many remote villages exist primarily because they're at strategic points along winter transportation routes. They serve as way stations, places where drivers can rest or take shelter, points where cargo can be transferred or temporarily stored. You're crossing a frozen river now, the truck's tires crunching on the ice, and Alexei slows to a crawl. This is the Aldan, he says, naming one of Siberia's major rivers. Ice here is usually good, nice, and thick, but you still respect it. I've seen trucks go through the ice. Usually the driver gets out in time, but the cargo is lost. 2 tons of fish sinking to the river bottom. That's a disaster, financially. Insurance doesn't really cover it, and even if it did, you've lost your cargo, probably lost your truck, maybe lost your reputation as a reliable hauler. The crossing takes about 5 minutes of careful driving, and then you're back on solid ground, or rather, solid frozen swamp. Alexei visibly relaxes slightly. Every crossing, every time, I'm a little tense, he admits. 23 years, and I've never had a serious incident. I'd like to keep it that way. The economics of fish transportation are complex. Alexei charges by weight and distance, roughly 15 rubles per kilogram per 100 kilometers, which means this load will earn him about 60,000 rubles, or roughly $600 US dollars. Out of that, he has to pay for fuel, which is expensive in Siberia and even more so on remote routes. He has to maintain his truck, which takes constant abuse on these roads. He has to pay for the occasional repair when something breaks. And he has to factor in the risk, the possibility of an accident, a breakdown, a load spoiling if unusually warm weather arrives unexpectedly. It's not a way to get rich, Alexei says, but it's honest work and it's important. The villages I pick up from depend on being able to sell their fish. The towns I deliver to depend on having fish to eat. I'm a link in a chain. Break one link and the whole thing doesn't work. So I do my job carefully, reliably. That's my reputation. You're looking at the GPS unit mounted on the dashboard. You're still about 120 kilometers from Yakutsk, about 3 more hours of driving at current speeds. Alexei points out a herd of reindeer in the distance, perhaps 30 animals moving slowly across the snow. Those are semi-wild, he explains, owned by someone, but they range freely. In the really remote areas, you'll see wild reindeer, bears sometimes, wolves occasionally. The Zimniki run right through their territory. Usually they avoid us, but you have to watch out. Reindeer on the road at night, very dangerous. They don't move quickly, and their eyes don't reflect headlights well. You can be right on them before you see them. The truck hits a particularly rough patch, and you hear the cargo shift slightly in the back. Alexei adjusts his speed, lets the truck settle. That's the sturgeon moving, he says. They're heavy, and I've got them on top of the lighter fish. Should be fine, but I'll check when we stop next. Don't want to arrive with the load all jumbled. Presentation matters. Buyers want to see that you've taken care of the product, even if it's frozen solid and basically indestructible. As the hours pass and the landscape continues its monotonous scroll of white and dark green, you find yourself thinking about the sheer audacity of this whole enterprise. You're traveling across terrain that would be impassable for most of the year, in a truck held together partly by hope and duct tape, carrying 2 tons of fish that have been turned into frozen planks by temperatures that could kill an unprepared person in minutes. And this is routine. This is how things work. This is infrastructure in Siberia, not concrete and steel, but ice and cold and the accumulated knowledge of generations of people who figured out how to make it work. Alexei mentions that younger people aren't as interested in this work anymore. My son lives in Irkutsk, works in computers. Good job, warm office, regular salary. He thinks I'm crazy for still driving Zemniki at my age. Maybe he's right, but someone has to do it. The fish need to get from the villages to the cities. The people in the cities need to eat. Technology hasn't replaced us yet. Maybe it will someday. Drones, automated vehicles, who knows? But for now, it's still guys like me in trucks like this, driving on ice roads, hauling frozen fish like they were lumber. The lights of Yakutsk are visible now in the distance. A glow on the horizon that gradually resolves into individual streetlights and building windows. Alexei starts his approach protocol, checking his mirrors, testing his brakes gently, making sure the cargo is secure for city driving. We'll unload at the market warehouse, he explains. I'll stack the fish on pallets. The market workers will take over from there. Probably some of these fish will be on sale by tomorrow morning. People will carry them home, thaw them, cook them, eat them. And they probably won't think about the journey. The fishermen who caught them, the cold that preserved them, the driver who brought them here. But that's okay. That's how it should be. The system works best when it's invisible. You help Alexei unload at the warehouse, getting your first direct experience with handling frozen fish en masse. They're heavier than you expected. A good-sized pike weighs 7 or 8 kilograms, and frozen solid, it's an awkward, unwieldy object to carry. You stack them on a wooden pallet according to Alexei's instructions, all facing the same direction, alternating layers perpendicular to each other for stability. The largest fish on the bottom, smaller ones on top. It's exactly like stacking wood. And after 15 minutes of work, you're breathing hard and your arms are tired. You see, Alexei says with a laugh. Not easy work, but good work. Physical work. You sleep well after a day of this. Ash. He's getting paid now by the warehouse manager, counting bills carefully before tucking them into an inner pocket. Tomorrow he'll head back out, maybe to a different village, maybe following a different route, but always with the same cargo. Frozen fish, hard as planks, preserved by cold, transported across impossible terrain, sustaining life in one of Earth's most challenging environments. You're in a bustling market in Yakutsk at 7 in the morning, and the temperature has dropped to minus 49 degrees. The market is partially enclosed, a series of connected buildings with high ceilings and walls that block the wind but aren't heated beyond what the crowd's body heat provides. Vendors have been setting up since before dawn, and now their stalls are arranged in neat rows, each one displaying frozen fish in various configurations. Some fish stand upright in wooden crates, packed tightly like books on a shelf. Others lie in horizontal stacks on tables. The largest specimens, sturgeon that might weigh 30 or 40 kilograms, lean against walls like pieces of architectural trim waiting to be installed. Your guide today is Olga, a woman in her early 60s who's been selling fish at this market for 38 years. She's wearing so many layers of clothing that she appears almost spherical, and her face is mostly hidden behind a scarf and fur-lined hood. But her eyes are bright and alert, constantly scanning her stall and the customers who approach. In winter, this is the best job, she says, her voice slightly muffled by the scarf. I'm cold, yes, but I'm moving around. I'm with people, I'm busy. Better than sitting alone at home. And the fish practically sell themselves when they're this good quality. Her stall specializes in omul, a fish species endemic to Lake Baikal that's prized for its delicate flavor and fine texture. She has perhaps 200 fish displayed, all frozen solid, all roughly the same size, about 30 to 35 centimeters long. They're arranged standing upright in a large wooden box filled with snow, which keeps them stable and makes them easy for customers to examine. The visual effect is striking. It looks like a school of fish frozen mid-swim, suspended in time. People shop for frozen fish differently than for fresh fish, Olga explains. With fresh fish, you check the eyes, they should be clear. You check the gills, they should be bright red. You smell it, should smell like clean water, not fishy. But with frozen fish, you can't do any of that. The fish is solid. Eyes are frozen. Can't smell anything through the ice. So people look at different things. They look at the shape. Is the fish straight or bent? Bent fish means it wasn't arranged properly when frozen, might have quality issues. They look at the skin. Is it intact or damaged? They check for ice crystals on the surface. A little frost is fine, but too much means the fish has been thawed and refrozen, which is bad. She picks up one of her omul to demonstrate, holding it vertically like a small club. The market is getting busier now. A steady stream of customers moves through the aisles. Mostly women, though you see some men too, and a few teenagers sent by their parents to pick up fish for dinner. Many customers are carrying canvas bags or pulling small wheeled carts. They stop at various stalls, examining the fish, asking questions, negotiating prices. There's a rhythm to the interaction that seems almost choreographed. Customer approaches, vendor greets them, customer indicates what they're interested in. Vendor selects a fish and presents it for inspection. Some discussion about price and quality. Agreement reached, money changes hands, fish is wrapped and handed over. You watch an elderly woman select 3 whitefish from a neighboring stall. The vendor wraps them in old newspaper, helps protect against freezer burn during transport. Olga explains and ties the bundle with string. The woman tucks the package under her arm and walks away. The wrapped fish stick out from under her arm like a small bundle of kindling. It's that same image you've been seeing throughout this journey. Frozen fish carried like wood, casually, efficiently, perfectly adapted to the environment. Olga sells an omul to a young mother who has a small child bundled up in a stroller beside her. The transaction takes about 90 seconds. How will you prepare it? Olga asks as she wraps the fish. Probably baked with lemon, the customer replies. My mother's recipe. Olga nods approvingly. Good choice. These omul are perfect for baking. Not too fatty, not too lean. Let it thaw slowly in your refrigerator, maybe 6-8 hours. Don't rush it. Rushed thawing makes the texture suffer. This advice about thawing comes up repeatedly. Properly frozen fish need to be properly thawed, and there's a whole body of knowledge about best practices. The ideal method, according to Olga and most experienced Siberian cooks, is slow thawing in a refrigerator, not at room temperature, never in warm water, and definitely not in a microwave. People who don't know, they try to rush it, Olga says. They put the fish in hot water, thinking it will thaw faster, and it does. But the outside thaws while the inside is still frozen, and you get mushy texture, loss of flavor. The fish loses its juices. All that good preservation we achieved with the fast freeze, wasted by bad thawing. The science backs her up. Remember what Dr. Elena explained about ice crystal formation. When fish thaws too quickly, those microcrystals that formed during rapid freezing don't have time to reintegrate properly into the cellular structure. Fluid leaks out. Texture degrades. It's not dangerous. The fish is still safe to eat, but it's not optimal. Slow thawing allows the ice crystals to melt gradually, the cellular fluid to redistribute evenly, and the texture to remain as close as possible to what it was when the fish was fresh. A middle-aged man approaches Olga's stall now, and there's a longer negotiation. He wants to buy in bulk, 20 omul for a family celebration. Olga offers a volume discount, and they haggle good-naturedly over the exact price. Eventually, they agree on 250 rubles per fish instead of the usual 300. Olga begins selecting fish from her inventory, checking each one carefully before adding it to the pile. For large order, I give him my best fish, she explains to you. He's a regular customer, comes every month. I want him to come back next month too. Good fish means good word of mouth. Bad fish means he tells his friends to go somewhere else. She wraps the 20 fish in layers of newspaper, creating a substantial package that must weigh 10 or 12 kilograms. The man hefts it experimentally, nods with satisfaction, and loads it into a large backpack he's brought for the purpose. Good fish, Olga Petrovna, he says formally. Your father would be proud of the quality you maintain. This seems to please her enormously. My father taught me everything, she tells you after the customer has left. He sold fish in this same market for 42 years. Started in 1947, right after the war. I used to help him as a little girl. I was 7 years old, carrying fish that were almost as big as me. Now I've been doing this 38 years. Maybe my daughter will take over someday, or maybe the tradition ends with me. She's studying to be a pharmacist. Better job, probably. Warmer, certainly. There's a note of resignation in her voice, but also pride. She's part of a lineage of fish vendors, maintainers of quality standards, preservers of knowledge about what good fish looks like and how to treat customers fairly. These markets are where traditional knowledge meets daily commercial transaction, where the frozen fish that come from indigenous preservation practices and Soviet-era transportation logistics finally reach individual households. You're watching the variety of customers now, and it strikes you how democratic this system is. The elderly pensioner buying a single pike for dinner pays the same per kilogram price as the wealthy restaurant owner buying 20 salmon. The quality is visible and verifiable to anyone with basic knowledge. There's no mysterious supply chain, no opaque pricing structure. The fish are right there. You can see them, touch them, inspect them, make your own decision. It's refreshingly direct in a way that modern supermarket fish buying often isn't. Olga's neighbor, a vendor named Victor who sells mostly pike and whitefish, calls over to share some gossip. A fishing community upriver has had excellent catches this year. The fish are larger and more abundant than usual. This means prices might drop slightly in the coming weeks as more supply reaches the market. Olga takes this information seriously, mentally adjusting her purchasing plans. She buys her fish from intermediaries who travel to fishing communities, so she needs to anticipate price fluctuations and buy strategically. The market price for frozen fish is actually quite stable compared to fresh fish. Victor explains when you ask. Fresh fish has to be sold quickly, so prices can swing wildly based on daily supply. But frozen fish? It lasts for months. If I have fish in storage and prices drop, I can wait. If prices rise, I can sell more. It's a buffer against volatility. Of course, I still need to move inventory. I can't just sit on fish forever, but I have flexibility that fresh fish vendors don't have. This stability is another advantage of the frozen fish economy that often goes unnoticed. In most fish markets around the world, prices fluctuate dramatically based on daily catches, weather conditions, seasonal variations. But in Siberia, the autumn freeze creates a reserve of preserved fish that can be drawn down gradually throughout the winter and spring. This moderates price swings and ensures more consistent availability. Historians still argue whether this stability was a factor in enabling larger permanent settlements in Siberia, but it's certainly true that reliable, affordable protein was crucial to population growth in the region. A young couple approaches Olga's stall now, clearly newlyweds based on their matching wedding rings and the way they're holding hands even through thick gloves. They're buying fish for their first dinner party in their new apartment. Olga becomes almost maternal, advising them on quantities. For good-sized omelette should be plenty for 6 people, especially if you're serving side dishes, and preparation methods. She even writes down a simple recipe on a scrap of paper. Don't be nervous, she tells them. These fish are very forgiving to cook. Hard to ruin them if you follow basic principles. And if you have questions, come back and ask me. I'm here 6 days a week. After they leave, Olga seems pleased. Young people learning to cook with real fish, not just buying prepared foods. This is good. Makes me hopeful. Some people think the old ways will die out, that everyone will just buy everything at supermarkets, prepackaged, impersonal. But I think there will always be demand for this, for being able to select your own fish, talk to someone who knows about quality, be part of a tradition. The supermarkets in Yakutsk do sell frozen fish, of course. You've seen them, plastic-wrapped fillets in freezer cases, standardized and sanitized and convenient. But many Siberians still prefer buying whole frozen fish from markets like this one. The reasons are partly about quality. Market fish are often better because vendors stake their reputation on it. Partly about price, market fish are usually cheaper because there's less processing and packaging. And partly about tradition and social connection. Buying fish from Olga isn't just a transaction, it's a brief human interaction, a moment of connection in the cold morning, a participation in cultural continuity. You notice that some customers bring their own wrapping materials, cloth bags, old newspapers, even small wooden boxes designed to carry fish. Smart customers, Olga comments. Save the wrapping, reuse it. Also, if you have your own container, easier to carry. Those fish can be awkward under your arm for a long walk home. She demonstrates by tucking one of her omel under her arm, tilting it at an angle. See? You want it angled forward slightly, not straight horizontal. More comfortable for long distances. Small details, but they matter. By mid-morning, Olga has sold about 60 fish, and her inventory is noticeably depleted. "Good morning," she says with satisfaction. "By afternoon, I'll probably be sold out. Then I'll restock for tomorrow." Her restocking involves going to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city where she keeps her reserve supply, about 500 fish in total, stored in an unheated shed where they remain frozen solid until she needs them. She'll select what she needs for the next day, load them into her car, bring them to the market. The car isn't heated during this process. Why waste fuel when the fish need to stay frozen anyway? A city inspector makes rounds through the market now, checking vendor licenses and conducting spot inspections of fish quality. He stops at Olga's stall, examines her documentation, selects a fish at random and inspects it carefully. He's looking for signs of thawing and refreezing, the telltale ice crystals, the discoloration, the texture changes that indicate poor handling. Olga's fish passes inspection easily. "Always does," she says after he moves on. "I don't sell bad fish. Not worth the risk. Lose your license, lose your reputation, lose your livelihood. Better to throw away fish that's questionable than to sell it and have problems." The market culture includes this kind of informal quality control too. Vendors watch each other. Customers share information about who sells good fish and who doesn't. There are occasional disputes. A customer claims a fish was bad. A vendor insists it was fine. But these are usually resolved through the market's informal mediation systems. Persistent sellers of low-quality fish simply don't last. Their stalls empty while others thrive. It's a kind of organic regulation that works surprisingly well. As noon approaches and the market begins to quiet down, most shopping happens in the early morning or late afternoon. Olga offers you tea from a thermos she keeps under her table. It's sweet and strong and wonderfully hot. You sit on a wooden crate beside her stall, sipping tea, watching the remaining customers browse. A cat wanders through, a half-wild market cat that lives on scraps and catches mice. It stops to sniff at Olga's fish display but quickly loses interest. "Too frozen," Olga laughs. "Even the cats know you can't eat them like this." The scene is almost timeless. If you didn't know better, if you ignored the modern clothing and the occasional cell phone, this could be the same market from 100 years ago. Frozen fish on wooden tables, vendors in heavy coats, customers making careful selections. The fundamental transaction, protein in exchange for currency, mediated by trust and expertise, hasn't changed. The fish are still carried home like wood, still thawed slowly, still prepared using recipes passed down through generations. The cold still does the work of preservation. The market still serves as the connection point between those who catch fish and those who eat them. "You know what I like most about this work?" Olga asks suddenly. "It's honest. I stand here, I sell fish, people eat them, everyone's need is met. No tricks, no deception, just good fish for fair price." In a complicated world, there's something satisfying about that simplicity. She drains the last of her tea and stands up, ready to continue her workday. Another customer is approaching, examining her omel with interest. Olga straightens her display, composes her face into its professional friendly expression, and greets the customer warmly. The market continues its ancient rhythm, frozen fish passing from hand to hand, carried away under arms, destined for family meals and celebrations and quiet dinners for one. This is where tradition becomes daily life, where the extraordinary becomes ordinary, where the strange sight of people carrying fish like wood reveals itself as simply the most practical way to navigate life in Earth's frozen places. You're at someone's home now, a modest apartment on the 5th floor of a Soviet-era building in Yakutsk. Your host is Marina, a schoolteacher in her 40s who invited you to experience a traditional Siberian fish dinner. The apartment is warm, maybe 22 degrees Celsius, which feels almost tropical after spending hours outside. The heating is provided by the city's central system, enormous pipes that carry hot water through the entire urban district. In the corner of the kitchen, leaning against the wall like a forgotten umbrella, is a frozen omul. Marina bought it at the market this morning, and it's been slowly thawing throughout the day. The timing is everything, Marina explains, touching the fish gently to assess its progress. If I want to cook fish for dinner at 7, I need to start the thaw by 10 or 11 in the morning. Too early and the fish thaws completely and sits around. Not good. Too late and it's still frozen when I need to cook it. You learn to judge it, to feel how the thaw is progressing. She presses her thumb against the fish's flesh. Still feels quite firm, but there's a slight give now. Another hour, maybe 90 minutes, she estimates. Perfect timing for dinner at 7:30. The kitchen smells of onions and butter. Marina is preparing side dishes while the fish completes its thaw. There will be boiled potatoes with dill, pickled vegetables from her grandmother's dacha, black bread, and a simple salad of cabbage and carrots. Fish should be the star, she says. Everything else is supporting actor. My mother taught me this. Don't overwhelm fish with heavy sauces or too many spices. Let the fish taste like fish. She's also preparing stroganina as an appetizer. Remember that dish you tried at the market? For stroganina, the fish needs to be completely frozen, so she's working with a second, smaller whitefish that she kept outside on her balcony. Using a knife that looks almost like a small hatchet, she begins shaving thin slices from the frozen fish. The technique requires practice. Too much pressure and the blade just bounces off the frozen flesh. Too little and nothing happens. But Marina has done this hundreds of times, and the ribbons of frozen fish curl away from the blade in perfect translucent spirals. Stroganina is celebration food, Marina explains as she works. We make it for New Year's, for birthdays, when family comes to visit from out of town. The special. You wouldn't make stroganina for just a regular Tuesday dinner alone. But today is Friday, and she's invited neighbors and friends for dinner, so stroganina is appropriate. She arranges the frozen fish curls on a ceramic plate, adds small dishes of coarse salt and black pepper, and places everything on the table. You eat it while it's still frozen, she reminds you. It melts on your tongue. Very unique texture. Her guests begin arriving. An older couple from downstairs, a young woman who teaches at the same school, and a family with 2 children. Everyone removes their heavy outer layers in the entryway, revealing the comfortable indoor clothing underneath. There's a ritual quality to the arrival. Greetings, embraces, the presentation of small gifts, a jar of homemade preserves, a bottle of vodka, some chocolates for the children. Russians take hospitality seriously, and dinner invitations are social events, not casual affairs. The stroganina is served first, and you watch how people eat it. They take a frozen curl, dip it in salt or pepper, and pop it into their mouths. For the first few seconds, it's just cold, tongue-numbingly cold. But then as the fish begins to thaw from body heat, the flavor emerges. It's clean and fresh and slightly sweet, with none of the fishiness that can sometimes characterize seafood. The children approach it cautiously at first, but then become enthusiastic. Mama, can we have stroganina at my birthday? The daughter asks. Her mother laughs. If you promise to help make it, yes. The conversation flows in Russian. You catch perhaps 1 word in 3 with your limited language skills, but the warmth and conviviality need no translation. People are discussing their weeks, sharing stories about work and family, laughing at jokes you don't quite understand. The vodka bottle makes an appearance, and small glasses are filled. To friendship, someone toasts, and everyone drinks. In Siberia, toasting is practically mandatory. You don't just drink, you drink to something, to health, to absent friends, to the coming spring, to good fortune. Marina checks her main fish now, the omul that's been thawing all day. She picks it up, feels its flexibility. Ready, she announces, and takes it to the sink to rinse under cold water. The fish is no longer rigid but not completely soft either, still slightly firm in the center, which is ideal for cooking. She pats it dry with a towel, makes a few quick cuts with a sharp knife to score the skin, then seasons it simply with salt, pepper, and thin slices of lemon tucked into the body cavity. I'll bake it in the oven, she explains. 30 minutes at 180 degrees. Some people prefer to pan fry, some like to grill, but I think baking is most foolproof. The fish cooks evenly, stays moist, develops nice flavor without adding too much complexity. She places the fish in a glass baking dish, adds a small amount of water to the bottom of the dish. This creates steam, keeps everything moist, and slides it into the oven. Now we wait and enjoy our company. The conversation has turned to ice fishing, a popular winter activity in the region. The older man, Dmitri, is describing a recent expedition to a lake about 50 kilometers from the city. "We drove right out onto the ice," he says, gesturing expansively. "The ice must have been a meter thick, could have landed an airplane on it. We drilled holes with an auger, set up our gear and waited. Caught 7 pike in 4 hours. Beautiful fish, all frozen solid before we even got them back to the truck." Ice fishing represents another dimension of the frozen fish culture. It's both practical food gathering and recreational activity. In Siberia, ice fishing season coincides with the coldest months, and it's become a social tradition. Groups of friends or family members spend entire days on frozen lakes, sitting in small shelters or around fires, fishing through holes in the ice, sharing food and drink, telling stories. The fish they catch freeze almost instantly in the cold air, requiring no additional preservation effort. It's fishing and freezing and socializing all rolled into one winter pastime. "My grandfather used to say that ice fishing taught you patience," Marina's friend Svetlana comments. "You sit there in the cold watching your line, waiting for a bite that might not come. It's meditative, peaceful, different from summer fishing where everything is fast and active. Winter fishing is slow, contemplative." She pauses, then adds with a smile, "Also, you drink more vodka in winter fishing, which helps with the patience." This prompts laughter and a tangent into stories about vodka and fishing. Apparently, it's a rich tradition combining the two. Someone tells a story about a fisherman who drank so much vodka to stay warm that he fell asleep on the ice and had to be rescued by his friends. Someone else counters with a story about using vodka to thaw frozen fishing line. The stories might be exaggerated, might be folklore, but they're part of the cultural tapestry that surrounds the frozen fish tradition. The timer dings, the omelet is ready. Marina pulls it from the oven, and the smell that fills the apartment is magnificent. Fish and lemon and butter and herbs. She brings the dish to the table with ceremony, placing it in the center where everyone can admire it. The fish has turned golden brown, the skin crisped slightly, the flesh visible through the scoring marks and flaking beautifully. "Perfect," Dmitri pronounces, and everyone murmurs agreement. Marina portions the fish using 2 forks, carefully separating the flesh from the bones, giving everyone a generous serving. The bones in a well-cooked fish should come away cleanly, and these do, a sign of both quality fish and proper cooking. You take your first bite, and it's exceptional. The fish is moist and tender, with a delicate flavor that the simple seasoning enhances rather than masks. This is what all that preservation science was about. Maintaining quality from the moment the fish was caught until this exact moment, days or weeks later, when it reaches someone's table. "This fish was probably caught in November," Marina says. "It's been frozen for 6, maybe 7 weeks. But taste it. Does it taste old? Does it taste like freezer? No, it tastes fresh because it was frozen properly, kept frozen properly, thawed properly, cooked properly. This is why we still do things the traditional way. Modern frozen fish from supermarkets, sometimes good, often not. But fish frozen in Siberian winter and handled with care, always excellent." The meal continues with more food, more toasts, more conversation. The children finish eating first and retreat to the living room to play. The adults linger at the table, picking at the remaining potatoes, nibbling on pickles, refilling tea glasses. Someone starts a story about a winter expedition years ago, traveling by snowmobile to a remote hot spring. Someone else remembers a New Year's celebration in a village that lost power, and how the entire community gathered in one building to share body heat and food. These stories all weave together, stories of winter, of cold, of community, of the ways people create warmth and connection in an environment that seems designed to isolate and freeze. And running through many of these stories, sometimes explicitly and sometimes just implied, is fish. Fish caught and frozen and shared. Fish as the protein that sustains life. Fish as an excuse to gather, to celebrate, to maintain traditions. Fish carried home under an arm like wood, then transformed through fire and skill into something wonderful. Marina brings out dessert, store-bought ice cream, and a homemade honey cake. I know, she laughs. Serving ice cream in Siberia is redundant. Everything here is cold. But the children insist. The ice cream actually stays frozen longer here than it would elsewhere. Even inside the warm apartment, the containers remain solid for extended periods. You could literally store ice cream on the balcony and it would keep indefinitely during winter months. As the evening winds down and guests begin preparing to leave, there's a moment of reflection. Svetlana, perhaps emboldened by the vodka, becomes philosophical. You know what I think? She says. I think we Siberians have made peace with the cold in a way other people haven't. We don't fight it, we don't curse it. Well, we curse it sometimes, but mostly we work with it. The cold preserves our fish. The cold gives us our ice roads. The cold keeps food fresh on our balconies better than any refrigerator. The cold is hard, yes, but it's also our ally. We've learned to carry frozen fish like wood because that's the smart thing to do. Practical. Simple. That's the Siberian way. Everyone nods. Even the children who don't fully understand but sense the importance of what's being said. These are the moments when cultural identity becomes explicit, when people articulate what it means to be from this place, to live in these conditions, to participate in these traditions. The frozen fish aren't just food. They're symbols of adaptation, resilience, and a particular relationship with an extreme environment. You help Marina clean up after the guests leave. She wraps the leftover fish in clean cloth and stores it in her refrigerator. We'll finish this tomorrow, she says. Maybe make fish soup or just warm it up with more vegetables. Good fish is never wasted. She notices you looking at her balcony, where several more frozen fish stand propped against the railing like forgotten tools. My winter supply, she explains. I buy maybe 20 fish in November, December, store them out there. Use them gradually through winter and spring. It's like having a freezer that costs nothing to operate and never breaks down. The balcony is colder than any appliance. My grandmother did this, my mother did this, now I do it. Probably my daughter will do it too, if she stays in Siberia. If she moves to Moscow. Marina shrugs, leaving the sentence unfinished. The implication is clear. In Moscow, you buy fish from supermarkets. You don't carry them home like wood. You lose something in that convenience, though you gain other things. It's the eternal tension between tradition and modernity. As you leave her apartment and step back into the -47-degree night, you're struck by how ordinary this has all been. A simple dinner with friends. Fish that started as a frozen plank and became a meal. Conversation and laughter and shared food. Nothing exotic or unusual by Siberian standards. Just daily life, just how things are done. But embedded in that ordinariness is something remarkable. A culture that has figured out how to not just survive but create richness and joy in conditions that would defeat most human communities. The frozen fish, carried like wood, are just one thread in that larger tapestry. But they're an essential thread, woven through thousands of years of adaptation and ingenuity. You're in a modern cold storage facility now on the outskirts of Yakutsk, and the contrast with everything you've seen so far is jarring. This is a massive industrial building constructed in 2019, equipped with state-of-the-art refrigeration systems, computerized inventory management, and loading docks designed for 21st century logistics. The facility manager, a young man named Konstantin who studied supply chain management in Moscow, is walking you through the operation, and he's explaining how traditional Siberian fish preservation is being integrated with contemporary global commerce. We're not replacing the old ways, Konstantin emphasizes as you walk through a refrigerated corridor where the temperature is maintained at exactly -25 degrees Celsius. We're augmenting them, scaling them up, making them compatible with modern retail and export requirements. The fundamental principle, rapid freezing in extreme cold, that's still the foundation. But now we're adding quality control systems, traceability, standardization, all the things that modern markets demand. The facility processes about 50 tons of fish per day during peak season, which runs from October through December. Fish arrive from fishing collectives and independent fishermen across the region, already frozen solid from being left outside in the cold, the traditional method unchanged. But here at the facility, each fish is scanned, weighed, photographed, and entered into a database. Quality inspectors examine random samples, checking for the markers of proper freezing. The microcrystalline structure, the intact cell walls, the absence of thawing and refreezing signs. We're building a brand, Konstantin explains. Siberian premium fish. The market in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, even export markets in China and Japan. They're willing to pay top prices for fish frozen using Siberian natural methods. But they want assurance. They want documentation. They want to know where the fish came from, when it was caught, how it was handled. That's what systems like ours provide. You're watching workers now sorting fish on a conveyor system. The fish are still frozen solid, still being handled essentially like pieces of lumber. Picked up, examined, tossed into appropriate bins based on species and size. But each bin has a barcode. Each bin's contents are tracked in the computer system. And when fish leave the facility, they carry documentation that follows them through the entire supply chain. It's the ancient practice of carrying frozen fish meeting the modern practice of supply chain transparency. The facility also has blast freezing capacity for fish that arrive not quite frozen, perhaps from areas where temperatures haven't dropped sufficiently or from summer fishing operations. These industrial freezers can achieve minus 60 degrees Celsius, replicating and even exceeding the natural Siberian freeze. Dr. Elena, the physicist you met earlier, would probably say it has to do with humidity levels, air circulation patterns, the specific rate of temperature decline, variables that are hard to control precisely even with modern equipment. Nature, it turns out, is still the best engineer when it comes to freezing fish in the Siberian context. Technology can approximate it, can certainly handle fish that weren't naturally frozen properly. But the gold standard remains. Catch the fish in late autumn, gut it immediately, leave it outside overnight, and by morning you have a perfectly frozen product. Konstantin shows you the export preparation area, where fish destined for international markets are being packaged. These aren't being wrapped in newspaper and carried away under someone's arm. They're going into vacuum-sealed bags, then into insulated containers with temperature monitors, then into refrigerated shipping containers that will maintain them at minus 25 all the way to Shanghai or Tokyo. The fish that a family in Beijing eats might have been caught in the Lena River, frozen in natural Siberian cold, and maintained at that temperature for 2 months before reaching their table, Konstantin says. They're paying premium prices, sometimes 3 or 4 times what the same fish would cost in a Yakutsk market, because they want that quality, that authenticity. There's an irony here that isn't lost on you. Siberian families have been getting premium quality frozen fish as a matter of course for centuries, not because they were seeking luxury, but because that's what the environment provided. Now, that same quality is being marketed as a premium product to wealthy consumers thousands of kilometers away. The economic value of the traditional practice is being recognized and monetized in new ways. But Konstantin is also aware of the tensions this creates. When export prices get high enough, fish that used to stay local start getting shipped out. Families in Siberian villages who used to catch and freeze their own fish, some of them are now selling to operations like ours because the money is too good to pass up. Then they're buying fish at the market instead of providing for themselves. It's complicated. Is it good that Siberian fish are bringing in foreign currency and creating jobs? Yes. Is it good that traditional self-sufficiency is declining? Maybe not. I don't have answers, just observations. You're in the facility's research and development section now, where Konstantin's team is experimenting with different freezing protocols, trying to determine optimal conditions for various species. They have sensors embedded in fish, measuring internal temperature during the freezing process. They have microscopes for examining tissue samples. They're conducting consumer taste tests, comparing fish frozen under different conditions. It's science in service of tradition, or maybe tradition being validated by science. The line gets blurry. One thing we've confirmed, Konstantin says, pointing to a graph on a computer screen, is that the old practice of covering fish with snow during freezing, remember Katerina mentioned that? It actually does improve texture in certain species. The snow acts as insulation and slows the freeze rate by about 15%, and for fatty fish like omul, that slower freeze produces better results. The indigenous peoples were right. They didn't know the thermodynamics, but they knew what worked. Historians still argue whether these traditional practices were developed through systematic experimentation or accumulated accidentally over generations, but the result is the same. Highly effective techniques that modern science is only now fully understanding. The covering with snow method, the specific timing of autumn catches, the practice of gutting immediately, all of these have scientific rationale that people discovered empirically, through trial and error and careful observation. The facility employs about 70 people full-time, with that number doubling during peak season. Many of the workers are young, in their 20s and 30s, and they represent a new generation of Siberians who are straddling traditional and modern approaches. They understand the old ways because they learned from parents and grandparents, but they're also comfortable with computer systems, international quality standards, and global market dynamics. They're carrying frozen fish like wood, but they're scanning barcodes while they do it. Konstantin introduces you to one of the quality inspectors, a woman named Irina who used to work in her family's small fishing operation. "My father still doesn't understand what I do here," she laughs. "He catches fish, they freeze, he sells them. Why do you need computers for this?" But I explain that we're trying to scale up what he does, to reach bigger markets, to get better prices for Siberian fishermen. He's skeptical, but he also cashed the check from selling his last season's catch to us, and it was 3 times what he would have gotten locally. So he's willing to see how this experiment goes. The tension Irina describes between traditional small-scale operations and modern industrial approaches is playing out across Siberia. Some communities are embracing the new systems, seeing them as opportunities for economic development. Others are resistant, worried about losing control over their resources and their way of life. And some are trying to find middle ground, participating in modern markets while maintaining traditional practices where possible. You're in the shipping area now, watching containers being loaded onto trucks. Some of these fish will stay in Russia, heading to Moscow or other major cities. Others are destined for export, the refrigerated containers marked with destinations like Beijing, Seoul, Tokyo. The trucks that will carry them include some that will travel on Zimniki, remember Alexei and his ice road adventures, and some that will use paved highways. The old infrastructure and the new working together, or at least alongside each other. The challenge with climate change, Konstantin says, his tone becoming more serious, is that our natural freezer might be getting less reliable. Temperatures in Siberia are rising faster than the global average. We're seeing more temperature variability, more midwinter warm spells that can partially thaw fish. The ice roads are becoming less predictable. Some routes that were reliable for decades are now questionable. This is why facilities like this are important. We provide backup. If natural freezing becomes less dependable, we have industrial capacity. But I hope it doesn't come to that, honestly. There's something about the traditional method, the simplicity, the sustainability, the connection to place, that I'd hate to lose. Climate change is the shadow hanging over all of this, and it will become even more relevant soon. But for now, Konstantin wants to show you one more thing. The facility's visitor center, where they've created a small museum of Siberian fish culture. There are displays showing traditional fishing methods, photographs of indigenous peoples with their frozen fish platforms, explanations of the science behind natural freezing. There's even a video interview with an elder Evenki fisherman, explaining the old ways in his native language with Russian subtitles. We're trying to honor the heritage, Konstantin explains. This isn't just about profit, about selling fish to foreign markets. It's about recognizing that what Siberian peoples have been doing for thousands of years is remarkable and valuable. The frozen fish carried like wood, that's our brand, our identity. We want to preserve that, even as we modernize other aspects of the operation. You're looking at one display in particular, a photograph from the 1920s showing a market scene almost identical to the one you visited with Olga. The same wooden stalls, the same fish standing upright in crates, the same customers in heavy coats examining their potential purchases. The caption reads, Yakutsk Central Market, 1923. Nearly a century later, the fundamentals haven't changed. The buildings are different, the clothing styles have updated, but frozen fish are still frozen fish, and the most practical way to carry them is still under your arm like a plank. As you leave the facility, Constantine's final comment stays with you. Technology should serve tradition, not replace it. That's what we're trying to do here. Use modern tools to support and extend practices that have worked for millennia. Keep the good, add what's useful, don't break what isn't broken. It's a balance, and we're still figuring it out. But I think we're moving in the right direction. Outside, the sun is setting, which in Siberian winter means it's barely mid-afternoon. The temperature is dropping toward -50. Somewhere out on the rivers and lakes, fishermen are checking their nets and traps. The fish they catch today will freeze solid overnight, preserved by nature's perfect cold storage system. Some will be eaten locally, prepared using recipes passed down through generations. Others will end up in facilities like Constantine's, tracked by computers, destined for markets thousands of kilometers away. But all of them will be carried, at some point in their journey from water to table, like pieces of wood, because in Siberia that's simply how you handle a frozen fish. It's practical, it's traditional, it's effective. It's home. You're standing on the banks of the Lena River in late March now, and something is different. The temperature is still cold, -18 degrees, but there's a quality to the air that wasn't there in January. The sunlight, though pale, lingers longer each day. You can hear water trickling somewhere beneath the ice, faint but distinct. Spring is coming to Siberia, which means the great thaw is approaching, and with it, profound changes to the entire system you've been exploring. Your guide today is Dr. Anatoly Petrov, a climate scientist who has been studying Siberian environmental changes for 23 years. He's brought you to this spot because it's one of his long-term monitoring sites, where sensors buried in the ice and permafrost continuously record temperature, pressure, and various other data points. But Dr. Petrov isn't just here to discuss the seasonal cycle. He's here to discuss how that cycle is changing. 20 years ago, he explains, pulling up data on a tablet, the Lena typically froze solid in mid-October and remained frozen until early May. 7 months of reliable ice. Now we're seeing freeze-up delayed until late October, sometimes early November. And breakup is happening earlier, mid to late April. We've lost almost a month of solid ice time in just 2 decades. The implications of this are cascading through the entire frozen fish economy. Remember Alexei and his ice road trucking? Shorter ice road seasons mean fewer opportunities to transport fish, which means communities are more isolated. Markets have less supply, and traditional distribution networks are strained. Remember the fishing collectives timing their major catches for the November freeze? That window is becoming less predictable. Some years, temperatures don't drop sufficiently until late November. And by then, some fish species have already completed their seasonal migrations. The indigenous peoples I've spoken with, Dr. Petrov continues, they notice these changes intimately. They tell me that fish behavior is different now. Species that used to be abundant in certain months are showing up at different times, or not showing up at all. Water temperatures are affecting spawning patterns. The whole ecological timing that people have relied on for generations is shifting. You're looking at a graph now on his tablet, showing temperature trends for Yakutsk over the past 50 years. The line is unmistakably rising, especially in the winter months. Average January temperatures have increased by about 3.5 degrees Celsius since 1970. That might not sound like much, Dr. Petrov says, but when you're operating in the range of -40 to -50, a 3-degree change is significant. It's the difference between fish freezing solid in 2 hours versus 5 hours. It's the difference between ice roads being safe versus marginal. It's the difference between food security and vulnerability. The permafrost itself is thawing, which creates additional problems. Buildings constructed on permanently frozen ground are now shifting as their foundations warm and become unstable. The storage sheds where families kept frozen fish, unheated structures that relied on the frozen ground to stay cold, are no longer reliably cold enough. Some communities are being forced to invest in electric freezers, which increases costs and creates dependency on electricity infrastructure that's already stressed in remote areas. There's also a psychological dimension, Dr. Petrov mentions. Siberian identity is deeply tied to the cold, to the idea of being people who have mastered extreme conditions. When those conditions moderate, when the cold becomes less extreme, less reliable, there's a sense of loss, of disorientation. The frozen fish carried like wood are part of that identity. If the fish don't freeze as reliably, if the practice becomes less common, something cultural is lost. Historians still argue whether cultures can maintain their essential character as their environmental context changes. But Dr. Petrov is pessimistic. Culture is adaptive, yes, but there are limits. The frozen fish tradition depends entirely on having extreme, stable cold. If that goes away, the tradition can't continue in its current form. It will transform into something else. Maybe fish are still important, but they're frozen in electric freezers rather than by nature. Is that the same tradition? Philosophically, I'd say no. Practically, maybe it doesn't matter. People will adapt. But something will be lost. You're driving now to visit a community that's already experiencing significant climate impacts. The village of Kuzier, on the coast where the Lena River meets the Laptev Sea, has seen dramatic changes in recent years. The journey takes several hours across increasingly unstable ice roads. Alexei would be nervous on some of these sections, where you can hear the ice creaking under the vehicle's weight. In Kuzier, you meet with the village elder, a man named Nikolai who is 78 years old and has lived here his entire life. His house is traditional log construction, elevated slightly on posts driven into the permafrost. But the permafrost is no longer permanent. "Look," he says, showing you where one corner of his house has settled about 15 centimeters as the ground beneath has thawed. Every summer now, more thawing. Every winter, less freezing. The ground is becoming soft, unreliable, like everything else. Nikolai's family has fished these waters for generations. He shows you photographs from the 1970s. Massive catches of Arctic cod and whitefish, all frozen solid on the shore, stacked in piles that reach taller than a man. We would catch fish in November, and the cold would hit so hard and fast that the fish would freeze before we could even get them back to the village. We'd just stack them on the ice, cover them with snow, and they'd keep until spring. Perfect preservation, every time. But now, Nikolai says the November cold isn't reliable. Some years, yes, still cold enough, but other years we get warm spells. Temperatures rise to -10, -5, even 0. Fish don't freeze properly. We've had fish partially thaw and then refreeze. You know what that does to quality. We've had fish spoil because they didn't freeze fast enough after catching. Things that never happened before are happening now. The community has adapted in some ways. A few families have pooled resources to buy a large commercial freezer, powered by a diesel generator. Fish that don't freeze naturally can be put in the electric freezer. But it's expensive, Nikolai explains. There's also increased predation pressure. As the climate warms, species that were previously rare this far north are moving in. Seals are taking fish from nets. Seabirds are more abundant and more aggressive. The ecosystem is reorganizing, Dr. Petrov explains. Species are shifting their ranges northward, following the temperatures they're adapted to. This creates new competition, new predation dynamics. The people here have to adjust their fishing strategies constantly now, responding to changes that are accelerating. You're attending a community meeting in the village hall that evening, where residents are discussing their options. The conversation is in Yakut with occasional Russian words mixed in, and Dr. Petrov translates the key points for you. Some people are advocating for more investment in electric infrastructure, better generators, more reliable power so that freezers can replace natural cold. Others argue that this makes the community more vulnerable, more dependent on outside resources. Better, they say, to adapt fishing practices to the new climate reality. Fish different species, fish at different times, find new preservation methods. A younger man, maybe 30 years old, proposes something more radical: relocate. If the permafrost is thawing, if the fishing is becoming unreliable, if the ice roads are dangerous, why stay? There are opportunities in Yakutsk, in other cities. We could leave. This suggestion is met with visible distress from the elders. Leave? Abandon the village that families have inhabited for centuries? Unthinkable. But the young man persists. Better to leave on our terms, planned and organized, than to be forced out by disasters. A building collapse, a starvation winter, something catastrophic. The meeting continues for hours, with no clear resolution. This is the reality of climate change in Siberia, not some distant future threat, but an immediate, present challenge that communities are grappling with in real time. The frozen fish carried like wood are becoming less reliable, and with them, an entire way of life is being questioned. Dr. Petrov mentions research suggesting that by mid-century, Siberian winter temperatures could be 6 to 8 degrees warmer than present day. But there are also uncertainties. Climate models aren't perfect, and Siberia's climate is particularly difficult to predict because of complex interactions between permafrost, vegetation, snow cover, and atmospheric circulation patterns. Some scientists think the warming will be even faster than current projections. Others think there might be periods of temporary cooling within the overall warming trend. What we know for certain, Dr. Petrov says, is that change is happening, it's accelerating, and communities need to prepare. Back in Yakutsk, you visit with Olga again at her market stall. You tell her about Kuzier, about the thawing permafrost and the unreliable freezing, and she nods sadly. I've heard similar stories from my suppliers, she says. Fish that used to be available in abundance are becoming scarcer. Prices are rising because supply is less predictable. Some of my regular customers, elderly people on fixed incomes, they're buying less fish because they can't afford it anymore. It's troubling. But Olga also sees resilience. Siberians have always been adaptable, she points out. We've survived the Mongols, we've survived Stalin, we've survived the collapse of the Soviet Union. Climate change is another challenge. And yes, it's a big one. But I think we'll find ways to manage. Maybe the methods change, maybe we rely more on technology and less on nature. But we'll still be here, and we'll still be eating fish. It's part of who we are. You think about Konstantin at the modern cold storage facility, investing in infrastructure that can partially replace natural freezing. You think about Marina, storing fish on her balcony but acknowledging that her daughter might not continue the practice. You think about the young people of Siberia, more connected to global culture through the internet, less tied to traditional practices, more willing to relocate to warmer climates for education and opportunity. The frozen fish carried like wood might be approaching the end of their historical moment. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually, as the climate that made them possible transforms into something different. What will replace them? Electric freezers and industrial cold storage, probably. Vacuum-sealed fillets shipped from distant fisheries, possibly. A continuation of the practice in modified form, hopefully. But the image of someone walking home from the market with a fish tucked under their arm like a piece of lumber. That person surrounded by -40 air that freezes their breath into ice crystals. That specific image might become historical rather than contemporary within your lifetime. As you prepare to leave Yakutsk, taking one last walk through the market where Olga and dozens of other vendors still sell frozen fish in the traditional way, you're struck by the fragility and the resilience existing simultaneously. The practice is threatened by climate change, by modernization, by generational shifts in values and lifestyles. But it's also deeply embedded, supported by infrastructure and economics and cultural identity. It's adapted before, from indigenous practices to Soviet industrialization to post-Soviet restructuring, and it might adapt again. The fish themselves, frozen solid and leaning against market stalls like forgotten tools, offer no opinion on their future. They're just fish, preserved by cold, waiting to become someone's dinner. But in their frozen forms, in the way people casually pick them up and carry them home, in the millennia of accumulated knowledge about how to catch them and freeze them and prepare them, in all of that, there's a story about human adaptation to extreme environments, about working with nature rather than against it, about the simple elegance of letting the world do your work for you when you're smart enough to align yourself with its processes. The sun is setting again, earlier now in March than it did in December, the lengthening days promising spring's eventual arrival. The temperature tonight will drop to -42, still cold enough for perfect fish freezing, still Siberia in winter, still the land where people carry frozen fish like wood because that's the practical, sensible, traditional thing to do. For now, at least. For now, the cold endures, The practice continues. The culture persists. Tomorrow is uncertain, but tonight, in -40 air, fish freeze solid and life goes on, as it has for thousands of years in Earth's coldest inhabited places. The night is deep now, and the temperature outside has fallen silent and still. Not peaceful exactly, but complete in its cold, in its utter indifference to human warmth or worry. Somewhere in the darkness, in villages scattered across the vast Siberian expanse, fish are freezing on platforms and in sheds, just as they have through countless winters before this one. The old methods persist alongside the new technologies, traditional knowledge sharing space with modern adaptation. And in the morning, people will wake and carry on, because that's what you do in places like this. You carry on, you carry frozen fish under your arm like wood, you make soup and share meals and tell stories, you adapt to what comes while holding on to what matters. The world is changing, yes, but humans have always been creatures of change and continuity both. Perhaps the frozen fish of Siberia will transform with the climate. Perhaps they'll find new forms while keeping their essential purpose. Perhaps a century from now, someone will look at old photographs and marvel that people once walked through -50 cold carrying frozen fish, and perhaps they'll also walk to their local market and select fish for dinner, continuing the thread even if the specific practice has evolved. Or perhaps something will be genuinely lost, and that loss will be mourned by those who remember. But tonight, right now, the practice lives. The fish freeze solid. The markets open at dawn. Life persists in the cold, as it always has, sustained by fish and adaptation and the quiet dignity of people who have made their home in impossible places and called those places home. Rest now. Let the cold settle around the edges of your thoughts. Let the image of frozen fish carried like would fade into gentler dreams. Tomorrow brings its own demands, but tonight belongs to sleep and to the satisfaction of understanding something remarkable. Something simple and complex at once. Something human and particular to one harsh, beautiful corner of our world. Sleep well.